Okay then, in today's video we're gonna go over all of the Season 4 balance changes, so with that being said, let's just jump straight on into it. First up then is going to be the mechanic changes, which resolve around the burn and frostbite status ailments. If your Loomian is burned, instead of your melee damage being reduced by 50%, it will now be reduced by 33%. And if your Loomian is frostbitten, instead of your range damage being reduced by 50%, it will now be reduced by 33% as well. These specific changes are being made to punish more offensive Loomians a lot less, especially with stab being 25%. Up next is a Nuller type chart change, which should hopefully be the last change, at least for a while. But Ice-type Loomians will now resist simple type attacks once again. So now overall, Ice-type Loomians will resist Ice, Air, and now simple type attacks. Next up is some item changes revolving around the Scorb cores. So, if a Scorb, Valens, or Garjon is holding one of the Flame, Freezer, or Voltaic core items, they'll still have their typings changed to Fire Metal, Ice Metal, or Electric Metal, but these core items will now also provide an extra 20% damage increase for their specific elements. So, for example, the Flame Core will change Garjon into a Fire and Metal type Loomian, and if this Garjon uses any Fire type moves, they'll become stab moves, so you'll get the 25% damage increase there. But now you'll also gain an additional 20% damage increase, which is the equivalent to the type essences. These changes are just to make the core items a little more useful, but you'll still have to wait until after Route 9 for Garjon to get access to some new moves. Next up, let's go over all of the brand new items being introduced, which all revolve around the weather. So these items are split into two different categories, being globes and scales. If you give a Loomian a globe to hold, when this Loomian enters the battle, it will summon that specific weather for 3 turns, and it will then consume the globe, making it a one-time use item. And if you give a Loomian a scale to hold, when this Loomian summons the same corresponding weather, either through an ability or a move, it will make that weather last for 3 extra turns than normal. And yeah, we have got different versions of these items for each of the weathers already in the game, which right now as I'm recording this, that would be rain, gust, fog, heat, and thunderstorms. But in the future, you can expect more of these items for new weathers when they're introduced, like snow for example. With these items, you can now expect a lot more weather teams to be running around, and to be honest, you kinda needed these items, especially for singles battles. Next up, let's go over the ability changes. Send-Off is going to have its healing effect increased to 50% instead of 25%. So this will be a nice buff for Tayoshinu since Lantorch doesn't really use this ability that much. Foresight and Wildfire will now require the user to have 100% of their health to gain priority, instead of having 50% or above. So yeah, a very big nerf for Foreman and Lantorch. I've talked to a lot of people in the community about potentially making the requirement 75% of your health or above, but most people agreed it wouldn't really change much about how broken these Loomians actually are. Disenchant will now also prevent enchantments from being used while the user is currently in the battle, instead of only removing them after the user switches into the battle. So a big buff for the users of this ability. Before this change it was just way too niche, whereas now it has got more uses. Confidence will now make the user also immune to Terrifying and Petrifying. Most people think of this ability as a filler ability, but now with it making the user immune to Flinches, Terrifying, and Petrifying, it will definitely come in handy, maybe more so for double battles over single battles. Resilience will now activate when the user is hit by any melee attack move instead of just moves that make contact. So hey, Obsidian and Tundrulum have been falling off a little bit in the metagame, so with this change we might see them come back swinging. Oh, and I guess the one Resilience Borak user might appreciate this change as well. And finally, Elusive will now reduce damage taken by 33% instead of 50%. This should hopefully make Borealis easier to deal with without completely gutting the ability, but we'll have to wait and see if that's actually the case. If the ability is still deemed too good after these changes, I can also go back and hit it with a nuller change if needed. Now let's go over Loomians gaining new abilities. Chaotiki now gets the ability Combustible instead of Noxious Weeds, which is definitely going to be more useful since without these abilities you already quad resist plants, whereas fire can hit you neutrally. Servalon now gets the ability Boneheaded instead of Vengeance. This is a brand new ability that makes the user immune to recoil damage from things such as Raging Tackle. Sorchi now gets the ability Disenchant, which actually doesn't replace any ability that Sorchi previously had, it just gained it as a secondary ability that wasn't already in use. Wiki Wiki now gets the ability Medic instead of Compliance. This is a brand new ability that will heal your ally by 25% of their health when the user switches into the battle. And apparently, I need to clarify, this ability will only work in double battles. Crabtana now gets the ability Power Claw instead of Expertise. This will just give Crabtana more options when it comes to choosing a damage boosting ability. And finally, Obsidian now gets the ability Sharp Claws instead of Premonition, which of course is going to give Obsidian a more offensive playstyle instead of having to rely on your very passive resilience option. And finally, let's go over all of the move changes, starting off with the brand new moves being introduced. Fishgana is going to be getting a brand new evolution move called Gulp, which is going to be a water-type ranged attack with 65 strength, 100% accuracy, and it will cost 45 energy. This move will remove the target's held item, and if the held item is a consumable, Fishgana will eat it on the spot. Also, Fishgana's previous evolution move Recycle will now be a rally move. And then Luxor is going to be getting a brand new level 1 move called Swiffen, which is going to be a light type support move, and it will cost 40 energy to use the move. And using this move will double the speed of all allies for 4 turns, which yeah, this is mostly going to be a doubles move. You probably shouldn't use it in single battles. Next up, let's go over all of the move changes. First up is Mega Kick, which is going to be getting a strength increase to 100 from 90, and Flaming Kick is going to be getting a strength increase to 90 from 80. These changes are mostly just to make these moves more viable, seeing as they have a lower than perfect accuracy. Yet his Wrath has now been completely reworked. It will now cost 60 energy instead of 90, and it will lower the user's melee defense and range defense stats by 1 stage each instead of locking the user into the move for 2 to 3 turns. Which, if we're being honest, there wasn't really much reason to use Himber's signature move, so now it's basically a Rogue Assault clone, but it's Earth type. And lastly is Nova Blast, which is having its secondary effect chance lowered to 10% instead of 30%. Which, yeah, this is just one of those super old moves that was made before the game came out, despite it not seeing an appearance for, I wanna say, a couple of years after the launch of the game. Basically, I just didn't double check the secondary effect chance when it was introduced to the game. Next up, it's time to go over one of the longer lists of changes being Loomian's gaining moves. The Eaglet line will now learn Hasten, Lightspeed Ray, and Barbs. The Weevil line will now learn Typhoon and Stun. Cosmeor will now learn Wonder Herb. Mamask will now learn Emulate and Climate Cannon. The Pyramine line will now learn Drudge, Hasten, Phantom Blast, Harrow, Dissipate, Mind Drain, Rock Slide, Safeguard, Hullabaloo, Climate Cannon, and Teardown. Metronet will now learn Mind Drain, Judgment, Rogue Assault, Power Focus, Harrow, and Barbs. The Hydrenia line will now learn Climate Cannon and Gust. The Pipsy line will now learn Climate Cannon. The Small line will now learn Climate Cannon and Barbs. The Nimvolt line will now learn Climate Cannon. The Whisper line will now learn Climate Cannon. The Somata line will now learn Mind Drain, Downpour, Wonder Herb, and Gust. The Bano line will now learn Raging Tackle. Sumobito will now learn Double Beat. Terraclaw will now learn Double Beat and Barbs. The Christmas Crater line will now learn Vine Lash. The Tariti line will now learn Downpour, Gale Force, Stun, and Climate Cannon. The Chompactor line will now learn Aqua Jaws, Accelerate, and Poison. The Pike line will now learn Harrow and Soulstorm. The Puff line will now learn Brawn Boost. The Kapoink line will now learn Blaze of Glory. Freezy will now learn Jetstream. Wrestlun will now learn Shadowbox. Buzzalun will now learn Double Beat, Counterpoise, Lunge, Hyper Sting, and Double Sting. The Coupling line will now learn Safeguard, Provoke, Downpour, and Gale Force. The Spirivi line will now learn Brawn Boost, Hazy Shroud, and Cycle Chomp. The Snaggle line will now learn Gale Force, Typhoon, and Gust. The Polypi line will now learn Stun. The Ketone line will now learn Slapdown, Hasten, Scapegoat, and Tone Barrier. The Terrypod line will now learn Lunge, Wave Wrecker, Body Slam, and Bane of Haste. The Scampy line will now learn Counterpoise. The Ibrella line will now learn Downpour and Gust. The U-Tiny line will now learn Bulk Up and Safeguard. The Kikaloot line will now learn Hullabaloo, Tone Barrier, and Gust. The Eliphage line will now learn Thunderblast, Thunderstorm, and Hullabaloo. The Singil line will now learn Wonder Herb and Safeguard. The Feevine line will now learn Scapegoat. The Fancub line will now learn Scapegoat, Soulstorm, and Barbs. The Kleptyke line will now learn Scapegoat. The Skalava line will now learn Brawn Boost. The Krabushi line will now learn Scapegoat. The Snowcub line will now learn Deep Freeze and Barbs. The Embit line will now learn Blaze of Glory and Clay Slap. The Spurwix line will now learn Safeguard and Barbs. The Cinnaboo line will now learn Safeguard. The Jimby line will now learn Tone Barrier. Celesting will now learn Tone Barrier. The Snikel line will now learn Soulstorm. The Coyote line will now learn Frost Breath. The Leopold line will now learn Teamwork. The Antsy line will now learn Briar Block. The Venile line will now learn Bait. Nevermare will now learn Barbs. Protagon will now learn Barbs. The Burroach line will now learn Barbs. Icicle will now learn Barbs and Icicle Fangs. The Greystone line will now learn Barbs. The Wild Owl line will now learn Barbs. The Igneo line will now learn Outburst and Muckbuck. The Dractus line will now learn Vinelash. Nimue will now learn Gust. The Vambat line will now learn Gust. And finally, the Goswing line will now learn Gust. And lastly, let's go over the last list of changes, being Loomian's losing moves. Dakuda is losing Venom Slash and Tase, which Tase is being replaced with Stun. This is a controversial change. I did a poll regarding it for Season 3, but I did say if there was enough complaints in Season 3, I would remove it for Season 4, and yeah, now we're here. A lot of people have complained about it. But if Dakuda falls off a lot because of this change, it could potentially relearn Venom Slash in the future. Rancidor is losing Draco Beam. This is just to try and tone back on Rancidor's offensive capabilities. It was just too hard to switch into it consistently. Dainuki is losing Banana Split and Provoke, which Provoke is being replaced with Tease. Dainuki was just too good of a handy user with all of its support options, especially seeing as it could use Provoke to prevent other Loomians from provoking it. Zulong is losing Fire Breath and Tase. Tase is being replaced with Stun. This is just to tone back on Zulong's coverage on the rain side. Also, I found out that the specific dragon that Zulong is based on apparently doesn't breathe fire. Halvantic is losing Tase, which Tase will be replaced with Stun. This isn't to specifically target Halvantic, I just want to tone back on the amount of Tase users we have in the game, especially because now we have Stun, which is way weaker. Plasmoth is losing Tase, which Tase will be replaced with Stun. This is a little more targeted, seeing how Plasmoth already has a lot of great support options. It wouldn't hurt for it to force it to rely on the support version of Paralyze, so it can actually be provoked. Ikazune is losing Tase, which Tase will be replaced with Stun. This shouldn't affect Ikazune too much, if at all. I don't think it ever used Tase, and it probably wouldn't use Stun either. Phagenaut is losing Tase, which Tase will be replaced with Stun. I don't think most defensive Phagenauts even considered running Tase, but again, I want to cut back on the Tase distribution, and if it does want to run Stun in the future, it now has to worry about Provoke. Stratosaur is losing Tase, which Tase will be replaced with Stun. This is a little more targeted, seeing as Stratosaur is super bulky and can spam Tase before it wants to Soul Burst. Charonix is losing Rant, which Rant will be replaced with Safeguard. Basically, as a Charonix hater, I just don't want Charonix to hit Light-type Loomians for super effective damage anymore, and it should make it a little bit easier to deal with the more offensive Charonix. And lastly is Cosmere, which is losing Outburst. This is mostly because Cosmere Unleashed was outputting way too much damage with Outburst while using Specialty Gloves and its ability Cosmic Pressure. And with that, we have now gone over all of the new Season 4 battle changes. Let me know in the comments down below what changes you like, what changes you don't like, and what changes you'd like to see in the future.